Hello? Yeah, okay. I'm here to talk about Asia. What is happening in Asia in terms of mega FTAs. Why mega FTAs? Mega FTAs are what we define as FTAs. Generally, there are the bilateral ones. Two countries, you negotiate. For example, Singapore, Japan, we negotiated FTA more than 10 years ago. But mega FTAs involves more than two countries. And in Asia, there are several of these type of mega FTAs that are happening. And because we see a lot of Japanese investments, especially in Southeast Asia, and therefore we've chose to focus on the two big developments in mega FTAs happening, which affects Japanese investments as well as the export economies in Southeast Asia. So the first one is AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community. ASEAN Economic Community has been said that it will be established by 31st December 2015, by this year. So what is that exactly? What does it mean for ASEAN, the 10 ASEAN countries? And what does it mean for businesses that are established in ASEAN? Then we will go on to talk about we'll go on to talk about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP or RCEP, as we call it. What is it? And how does it again affect businesses that are set up in Asia? And then when we're done, we will look at, because both AEC and RCEP are supposed to conclude by 2015, by this year. So what happens after 2015? Does that mean that FTA activities will go away? Going forward, what can we expect, and how will post-2015 affect our businesses in Asia? So, moving on, just to give you a brief overlook of why is it important. These are only FTAs happening in Asia. And as of 2014, this is June 2014, there are a total of 203 FTAs involving Asian countries, which is huge. As compared to year 2000, about 14 years ago, we only have about 26 FTAs. So within a span of about 14 years, we are seeing a lot of FTA activities happening in Asia, which affects the business environment, the regulatory environment, and the supply chain flows within Asia. So this is a very important development, and we are expecting, because the economic activities, well, I guess the 21st century is known as the Asian century, so we are expecting to see a lot of these type of FTA activities moving ahead after 2015 as well. So which is why Asia, in terms of FTA activities, is important in the coming years. Okay, this is what's happening, and this is just a very, very small sampling of what is happening, what is being negotiated in Asia right now. So you have this. Of course, you know, ASEAN, the 10 ASEAN countries, that's Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. So 10 ASEAN countries, we have formed the ASEAN Free Trade Area. So that's the one in red. All right. Then this is SAFTA. So this involves the Indian subcontinent. So we have India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and so on. So this is another big preferential trading area, which is not as established as ASEAN. All right. And then of course Australia, New Zealand is one block. Now what is happening is within Asia Pacific, there are a lot of all these bilaterals between Australia, China, between Japan, New Zealand, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of individual two-country FTAs going on currently. Then this big, huge agreement that covers 16 countries. This is what RCEP is all about. This is what the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is all about. It's about the 10 ASEAN countries, plus Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, Korea, and India. So 16 countries that forms the RCEP, that forms a mega FTA grouping within the Asia-Pacific region. Then of course, individually, we have the EU negotiating with some Asian countries. The Gulf Cooperation, this is in the Middle East. So the Middle East countries have or are negotiating. And well, the US doesn't have that many with Asia. And then these are the Asia-focused internal to Asia. We have these other FTAs. So there are a lot of activities going on. So how would businesses be able to take into account all these FTAs in your strategy? How do you plan to use? How do you actually use this FTA? So whether or not, for example, do you use the, for example, some of the FTAs are already in place, like the EU-Korea FTA is already being implemented. Singapore-EU FTA concluded negotiations, is going to be ratified, I think, earliest end of this year or by early next year. So how do businesses understand the FTA and make use of the FTAs? Because there are so many of them around. And generally it takes about 2 to 3 years, especially when we're talking about supply chain planning. It takes about that time to do the planning as well. Now, very quickly. Okay, now we focus on the ASEAN Economic Community. Just now I mentioned ASEAN, 10 countries. So there are 10 countries with a big range of economic development. The level of economic development is very different, ranging from Myanmar, which is one of the least developed countries in Southeast Asia, to Singapore, which has one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. So what is ASEAN Economic Community? What is AEC? Now, to know what is AEC, we have to look at how is AEC going to be born. Okay? So the target, AEC here, this is what is going to happen. The leaders are going to come together at the end of this year to announce the establishment of the ASEAN community. Okay, so by 31st December 2015, ASEAN community will be set up, including the ASEAN Economic Community. But what happens is that it's not like a big bang, it's just a milestone. It doesn't mean that 2015, December 31st, 2015, you go to bed. 1st of January 2016, you wake up, something new has happened. No, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that it's just accumulation of what has taken almost 20 years to build. So actually, the AEC is almost like accumulation of 20 years of small little baby steps that ASEAN has taken to arrive at AEC 2015. That's what it means. And what does AEC actually comprise of? The most visible part will be this pillar here. All right? For businesses, this has the greatest impact. You will see a free flow of goods amongst the 10 ASEAN countries. So it's easier, so you don't pay duties when you move goods from one country to the other, technically. And then there are ongoing activity to liberalize, to open up the markets for trade in services, for services trade. And then there will be a freer flow of capital, free flow of investment, and so on and so forth. So this, for businesses, this is a major development for AEC. This is what we will see in this year. And what it means for global and regional supply chain why did it happen? Because ASEAN countries realized that we actually don't originate a lot of things in Southeast Asia. Okay? A lot of investment flows come from outside of Southeast Asia, outside of the 10 countries. So it's important for Southeast Asia countries to fit into the entire global supply chain networks. As it is, intra-ASEAN trade between the 10 countries only constitute about 25% of total trade for ASEAN. So it's actually not a lot of trade. But a lot of the movements of goods, why is that so? Because the end products of the production in ASEAN are actually sold to markets like Japan, like China, like the EU, and like the US. So at the end of the day, ASEAN supply chain has to be integrated into the bigger global supply chain. So this is the end result of this is at the end of it, what the ASEAN government wants to achieve, is to have a bigger footprint in global supply chain. So we want to be a part, we want to be captured in the link of companies like the Japanese companies. We're not just talking about ASEAN as a market for goods, but ASEAN as a production, as part of the production chain of global networks. So this is actually a major objective for ASEAN, especially when we are talking about opening up the trade in goods area. So to focus on that, what does it mean? ASEAN has always been about trade in goods. Trade in services, opening up the services market is secondary up to maybe the last few years. But at the very beginning, ASEAN has always been about trade in goods, how we can move goods from, for example, Thailand into Indonesia, from Indonesia into the Philippines, duty-free. All right, so for ASEAN, by now, we are talking about February 2015 right now. Duties for all the ASEAN 10 countries, on average, has come down to, on average in ASEAN, has come down to only 0.23%. For CLMV, which is Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, average duties have come down to 0.55%. So duties for intra-ASEAN trade is very, very low now. Okay, so and if you look at intra-ASEAN trade, 0% duties. Goods going into CLMV, about 72% of goods are already duty-free for ASEAN goods, for ASEAN originating goods. And for ASEAN 6 is, let me see, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand. Okay? So these are ASEAN 6 countries. And for ASEAN 6, about 99% of all goods enter ASEAN markets duty-free, subject to originating conditions, of course. So, but for ASEAN, it's very straightforward. 40% regional value content. As long as 40% of the goods, the value of the goods are manufactured, are captured in ASEAN, you will get 0% duty. Which is why a lot of companies have, in the past 20 years, because in the past 20 years ago, each of the ASEAN countries maintained very high import duties on parts and components, on finished goods. But over 20 years, because all the import duties have come down, now companies are seeing, instead of the Thai market, the Indonesian market, the Philippines market, or the Vietnamese market, they are now seeing and treating ASEAN as one big market and one big production site, where they can move goods across the different facilities in different markets. So this is most of it. We have a lot of Japanese clients have been very, very progressive in making use of the ASEAN FTAs. We see a lot of the automotive companies they have been the front runners in making use of the ASEAN Free Trade Area. The electronics industry have been very, very active as well. So what they have done is they make parts in Thailand, they make other parts in Indonesia, and then a third part in the Philippines. And they are able to then move these parts into the various, let's say, the automotive factory in Thailand or in Indonesia to build into a finished CPU, for example, all at duty-free. All duty-free. So, in other words, the cost of manufacturing, of production within ASEAN has come down considerably, and then they can also export these finished goods to markets in ASEAN duty-free as well. So for a lot of the Japanese companies, the ASEAN agreement has been very productive because it contributes a lot to the reduction in production costs. All right, so this is one big milestone, and that has already been achieved under the AEC 2015. Now, okay, now AEC 2015, we are now moving from the very obvious import duties, because import duties you can see, is either you pay 5% or you pay 0% duty. So that's very obvious. Now ASEAN is moving into the less obvious part of trade facilitation. We are looking at all the non-tariff barriers that affects the movement of goods across national borders. Okay? So now for AEC 2015, this is what we are expecting. This is already done, rules of origin is already done. So just now I mentioned, in order to enjoy duty-free in ASEAN, you have to meet the 40% rule. That was the old rule. Now they open it up to other rules which are more liberal, so which would make it easier for companies to qualify for duty-free in ASEAN. So there are various rules that companies can make use of. But what is equally important and very interesting development, this will kick in by 2015. So these are what we call the paperwork, the administrative requirements that cost time, that has administrative costs and fees attached to this type of very operational work, but nonetheless cost in terms of time to delivery, time to market, because if you have to file for 10 documents instead of 1 permit, it takes a lot of time. So what AEC hoped to achieve is this. This has been resolved already, back-to-back. Does anyone know what back-to-back certificate of origin is? You know? Okay. Anyway, back-to-back certificate of origin is interesting for ASEAN, and this is important later on for the RCEP. Because back-to-back affects your trading activities. So if you're a trading company, back-to-back is very important to you, and so is third-party invoicing. Now, back-to-back means if you manufacture in Vietnam, you have a trading facility in Singapore, and you want to sell to Indonesia, for example. So you don't want your Indonesia customer to know where you're buying from or how much you're buying your product from your Vietnamese supplier. So what you can do is, in Singapore, when the goods are imported from Vietnam into Singapore, you get a back-to-back certificate from Singapore Customs, which will show you as the exporter, and that will put your invoice price on the certificate of origin. So when you send your products to Indonesia, your company name will be the only name that appears on the certificate. And your invoice price is the only price that will appear on the certificate. So that's a good mechanism for trading companies, or for companies that have distribution hub or production hub in ASEAN. Okay. Similarly, third-party invoicing is important. For example, I know a lot of Japanese companies, you invoice from Tokyo, you invoice from Japan, but your goods, you manufacture your goods in Thailand, maybe, and you sell to customers in Indonesia. but you invoice from Japan. So this mechanism, because for a lot of CO, in the past for ASEAN FTA, you cannot have a third-party invoicing. So you cannot claim, so in the past, when you import into Indonesia using a Japanese invoice, a Japanese card invoice, your goods cannot claim the duty preference. You cannot just pay duty-free. But what happens with third-party invoicing is now, if your goods enter Indonesia with an invoice from Japan, your goods can enjoy duty-free because it originates from within ASEAN. So this is a pretty good mechanism, again for trading houses or for companies with a consolidated sales office. And this is something that will be useful, and that's what we expect the RCEP to have as well. Self-certification, this is relatively new, so we are doing a pilot project, 2 pilot projects that are ongoing. Self-certification means that you have very accredited companies, exporters, who are able, so instead of getting an authorized certificate from customs that says, okay, my good originate from Thailand, for example. So under the self-certification scheme, the exporter themselves can write on the invoice or fill up a certain standard format that says that they certify themselves that their goods meet the rules of origin requirement and therefore they can enjoy duty-free. So this for companies, it saves money and it saves time because it takes, every shipment requires 1 certificate of origin. So if you have, so for a company, a big company especially, if you have multiple shipments in one day, can you imagine? I have some clients, 200 shipments in one day. So they have to apply for 200 different COs. So paperwork takes time. And each time you apply to customs for a certificate of origin, you have to pay processing fee. So all this means if you do a self-certification, you save time and you save money in terms of administrative fees. So this is a very good development that is going on right now. But what is important to know, Pilot 1 applies to manufacturers and traders, and certain countries, these 6 countries are using in the pilot program. And Pilot 2 applies only to manufacturers. So only manufacturers, so trading houses cannot make use of this agreement. Only if you manufacture in ASEAN, then you can make use of the Pilot 2. So what is happening right now, by end of this year, by 2015, ASEAN has to decide what mechanism they have to use. They have to merge Pilot 1 and 2 together. So at the end of this year, we will see what is the actual mechanism that will apply to ASEAN going forward. After 2015, what will happen? Okay, so this is important, especially for trading houses. Then the other big thing that's happening, which self-certification is moving ahead quite well, depending on the number of exporters. This self-certification is moving quite well. But national single window and ASEAN single window, what happens is that right now to set up to export a product, you have to go to multiple agencies to obtain import license, import permit, export license, export declaration. So in some countries like Indonesia, for certain types of products, you need to get 10 permits, okay, from different agencies. So and a lot of these agencies, you actually submit almost the same information. So there's a lot of duplication work involved. And again, it costs time, it costs money, because every import permit, every import license, you need to apply, you have to pay a fee. So what happens here is they are putting everything into one permit, one window. So you go into, they are creating a electronic system where you only need to input once and the information gets shared amongst the different agencies. So for businesses, it cuts down on administrative costs and it also cuts down on human error, because if you have to input the same information 10 times, you can be quite sure that mistakes will be made. Okay? And what happens with national single window, what the expectation is, they will link all 10 countries together into the ASEAN single window in the future. So this means that if you are importing, let's say, into Singapore, you input the information, your goods information once. Comes into Singapore, so this information gets shared. So if later on it's re-exported, so if you're a trader, it gets re-exported from Singapore to Thailand, it gets re-exported to Vietnam, because you are a distribution hub in Singapore, you import goods into one ASEAN country, it gets re-exported to the other 9 countries. You technically do not need to later on input the same information for the other countries, because you have the ASEAN single window. So all the information gets shared. So again, this is a way for ASEAN to cut down on the paperwork, the red tape. So this is a development for moving forward. So you have also the e-customs Form D, so you can apply for Form D online. The electronic version gets transmitted. And there's this something that is currently they're building, the National Trade Repository, which means that all the trade regulations, the laws, the practices, everything you can find online in ASEAN. So there will be a central, like a library, where you can go to access all the trade regulations for all 10 ASEAN countries. So this is in development right now. So moving forward, we are expecting the next few years these things to come online. Now, for other aspects, so this is the bureaucratic aspect, this is all the paperwork. Now this part, the regulatory regime. We know importing goods, you pay duties, you get your goods in. But in a lot of cases, you still have to go for testing. If you don't meet the safety requirements, you can never introduce your product into the domestic market. So what happens in ASEAN? ASEAN is trying to bring together the regulatory regime to harmonize the regulatory regime for certain types of products, to have a common regime within ASEAN. So what has happened is that for the most advanced is, of course, electrical and electronic equipment. There's a harmonized standards now. So if you are able to sell into one ASEAN country, you can basically roll it out in all the other 10 ASEAN countries. So these are the existing products that we have. So this one, the E&E, the triple E's, we have a harmonized regime already. And we also have the conformity assessment arrangement, which means that if you get it tested for Singapore, you don't have to retest when you send the same product to Indonesia, to Thailand anymore. They will accept the conformity assessment report that you did in Singapore. So this again cuts down on the paperwork, the cost of sending your product for lab testing. And medicinal products, this is pharmaceutical products, so if any of you are manufacturing pharmaceutical products, if you want to set up shop in ASEAN, there is a current MRA on good manufacturing practices. So in other words, there's a common platform. You manufacture a drug, a medicine in, let's say, Thailand, under the GMP MRA, that will get accepted as a practice by Indonesia. Okay. So this again cuts down on the red tape. It cuts down on your time to market for a lot of these. A lot of these are time-sensitive products. So it cuts down on your time for delivery to the ASEAN markets, and it cuts down on the cost of testing. And now this next big thing, very difficult to achieve, because there are so many barriers to trade, to investment in ASEAN. Okay, but this is what they are attempting to do. They are building a database, and for ASEAN, they now, every time they come up with a new measure, every time they come up with a new law, a new regulation that impacts trade in goods, they must notify the ASEAN Secretariat. So this is more for transparency purposes. What is more interesting for a lot of our clients is this part, identification of non-tariff barriers. So let's say if the excise tax applied on imported goods is different from domestic product, that is a non-tariff barrier and that can be taken up. That is not consistent. So, but a lot of times we won't know because it's the businesses who are actually experiencing the unfair treatment, the non-tariff barriers. So what happens is this one, it'd be useful for a lot of businesses. You can contact the national governments themselves, or you can contact ASEAN Secretariat. There is a website that you can go into to let them know the type of non-tariff barriers that you have experienced, for example, in Indonesia. You describe it, and they will put it onto this case study, and they will negotiate with the country involved, like Indonesia, to remove the trade barrier or to change it in such a way that it wouldn't affect trade unfairly. So this is something positive that the businesses, I would urge a lot of my clients to do, is to actually present cases to Secretariat. Because the governments won't know what you are experiencing on the ground unless you tell them. So this is a good venue. If you have any complaints, you come across anything that you can't do in the ASEAN countries, this is one way of making yourself heard. Okay? So this is the good side. Now services. Services is slightly lagging behind trade in goods. Trade in goods is actually very straightforward. They are almost done. 2015, they would have achieved everything they say they will achieve. Trade in services is trade in services and investment is a little bit more difficult because it's very, very highly protected in ASEAN. So this is these are all the milestones that ASEAN is supposed to achieve. So if you look at logistics, for example, by 2013, we have already passed in 2015 now. ASEAN countries are supposed to allow for ASEAN shareholding for logistics services at 70%. So majority shareholding for ASEAN companies. All right, so for example, in Indonesia, I think foreign-owned companies, foreign-owned logistics companies are not supposed to have investment. I think for internal trucking and internal transportation, you are totally not allowed to set up shop in Indonesia. But under the ASEAN agreement, technically, they are supposed to allow ASEAN investors up to 70% shareholding. But then we have the argument that is right now ongoing in ASEAN. Who is an ASEAN investor? So Indonesia and Thailand would like ASEAN investor to be only going by nationality of your major shareholder. So, but Singapore, of course, because most of Singapore companies are foreign invested. So what Singapore would like, and this is actually what is already agreed in the ASEAN agreement, is that as long as you have substantial, as long as number one, you are incorporated in any ASEAN country, so as long as you are a private limited, for example, okay? So it doesn't matter what your original shareholding is. So if you are a Japanese company, you open up a private limited company in Singapore, and you conduct substantial business operations. So you're not just a mailbox, okay? It's not a virtual office. You actually have people working there. You do whatever it is that you do, conduct business in Singapore. So technically, under ASEAN agreement, that Japan owned but Singapore incorporated company is considered an ASEAN investor. So from Singapore, you can use the Singapore private limited company to invest in Indonesia up to 70%. Technically, that's what you're allowed to do. But of course, as with everything in ASEAN, it depends on which country. All right? If you go to Indonesia, the Indonesians will tell you, yeah, but you know, technically you're Japanese, you're not Singaporean. Okay? But that's very difficult for them to trace your parentage up to whichever the original parent is. So right now, they have no way of tracking, which is why they are allowing whatever investments from Singapore, even though the parent is American, Japanese, European, they are all allowed to benefit from the ASEAN Trade and Services Agreement. Okay? But again, this is further to be developed. There are package 10, so 10 package completed this year, so the details are not out yet. They are going to announce it this year, package 10, and this is what package 10 will consist of. So this is still not public information. We don't know what exactly is contained in package 10, but this will happen in 2015. What has also happened is professional services is already concluded. We recognize professional qualifications from ASEAN countries, but condition, it does not affect immigration. It doesn't cover immigration, it just covers professional certification. Okay? So it doesn't mean that, let's say, I'm a Thai doctor. I want to practice in Singapore. Yes, you can practice in Singapore technically, because Singapore accepts the medical certificate from Thailand. But you still cannot come in and set up your practice in Singapore, because you still have to go through immigration. And immigration is not covered in the FTA. Okay, so that's a major difference, and there are so many things that we have to take care of when we look at services. And of course, this is movement of people. Again, it tells you who can move across, but it doesn't mean you don't have to get a visa. You still have to get a visa. Okay? All right, we're done with AEC.
今のAEC のお話が終了したんですが、非常に日本の企業にとりまして AEC の重要なポイントはおそらく2つではないかと思われます。一つはメガ FTA の中で発行日が唯一決まっているのがこの AEC でございます。今年の12月31日をもって正式にスタートいたします。加えて忘れてならないことは、この ASEAN を中心に今、アジアで FTA のネットワークが出来上がっているという点でも非常に重要でございますし、ASEAN の中には TPP、および RCEP の交渉メンバーが全部含まれているという点でも重要でございます。1997年、ご記憶の方もいらっしゃると思います。タイバーツの下落を発端に東アジアの金融危機が発生いたしました。その反省っていうのは ASEAN の中ではものすごく根強いものがございます。私も当時シンガポールに駐在しておりましたので、どれだけ大きな影響が皆様の企業に及んだかというのは体感をさせていただいてございます。その反省を踏まえて、なんとか強固な一枚岩の ASEAN を作りたいというのが AEC かと思いますので、ぜひご期待をいただきたいと思います。では、この次は東アジア包括経済連携協定 RCEP についてお話をいただきたいと思います。
Alright, so moving on to RCEP. So I mentioned just now, RCEP is a 16-party agreement. It's ongoing. The negotiations are ongoing right now. It's been a little bit up and down. It's a bit difficult. And there's not much information coming out from the RCEP because everyone's attention has been very focused on the TPP. Because a lot of the analysts, the trade analysts, are saying the TPP will have a lot of impact on the regulatory, the business environment in the TPP countries. It will be because it's the most comprehensive agreement that we have seen so far. But personally, being in Asia, being in Southeast Asia, and because I advise a lot more on supply chain issues, production issues, I think personally, I'm more excited by the RCEP because of the impact on Asia's supply chain flow. So what is happening with, so this is what's currently ASEAN as the center, ASEAN, the 10 member ASEAN countries, what ASEAN has is bilateral individual agreements with India, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Korea, with Japan, with China. And these are all implemented already. Okay, so we have what we call ASEAN plus 1 FTA. So these are the 6 dialogue partners for ASEAN, and with each of these countries, ASEAN already has an existing FTA. So we have an 11-party FTA between ASEAN and India, for example. Okay, so this is the existing. We are implementing this now. But, okay, for ASEAN, we all know ASEAN, intra-ASEAN trade is only 25% of total ASEAN trade. So which means ASEAN trades more with the outside world than within ASEAN. For example, China is actually ASEAN's biggest export market. Okay? So our biggest trading partner, for example. And so Japan, I think, is now number 3, if I'm not wrong, trading partner. But the flow of trade is very interesting. Between ASEAN and Japan, for example, more than 50% of ASEAN trade with Japan, exports with Japan, is in intermediate goods. So Japan, the flow, the Japanese export to ASEAN, more than 50% are in intermediate goods. So the high value parts and components come from Japan, gets assembled into finished products in ASEAN, and for export from ASEAN to other markets, to the more developed markets in the world. I think ASEAN back to Japan, only about 30-something% of the ASEAN export are in intermediates. Most of the trade are in other finished goods, commodities, and other types of products. ASEAN's trade with, it's not here, ASEAN's trade with the US, for example, also mostly in finished products, not intermediate goods. So we can see that the pattern of trade is that parts and components come into ASEAN for assembly into finished goods and then export to the developed markets. But what has been interesting is the development between China and ASEAN. China and ASEAN used to compete in finished products. So terrible. Indonesia really doesn't like the influx of cheap Chinese consumer products from China. Okay, they have a very bad relationship. But what we see these days, there's been a new trend in that now a lot of the ASEAN, the China trade into ASEAN has slowly moved into the intermediate products. And ASEAN has sold a lot more finished goods to the Chinese consumer market. So the pattern of trade has changed in the recent about 3 years or so. So we have seen a slow shift in the pattern of trade between ASEAN and China. Okay, so this is important because just now when I was talking about the AEC, ASEAN wants to fit itself into the global production supply chain. So what ASEAN has done is, yes, we have linkages with individual countries, right? With our biggest, actually these 6 countries are our biggest, one of our biggest export markets. So what is happening here is this. But what is missing is that, yes, we have intermediate products, the high value parts and components coming in from Japan, assembly into ASEAN. But because Japan and China does not have an FTA, when we export our finished goods from ASEAN to China, sometimes we cannot meet the ASEAN-China FTA requirements, and therefore we cannot have duty preference into China for a lot of the products which comes with Japanese parts and components because of the missing link here, right? So this is what is happening. We have ASEAN plus one. We are okay. We have access to all our 6 markets. We have bilateral. There are so many bilaterals going on here. But what is missing? Very important. China and Japan does not have an FTA. Japan and Korea does not have an FTA. China and India does not have an FTA, and Japan, New Zealand negotiating. We don't have one yet. Okay? But these are key parts because we have the missing link here. So we are unable. So for companies, when they talk about really restructuring their supply chain flow, they're stuck because of all these missing links. So what ASEAN has done is they have proposed this. No more individual links. All 16 countries will be under one FTA, which means that as long as the goods come from, the parts and components come from Japan, that's manufactured in ASEAN or export into China, we can have 0% duty. We can be duty-free when exported to China. So this, for companies, for a lot of my manufacturing clients, this is a very, very interesting FTA because they can then take the 16 countries as one big supply chain, one big production space, as well as one big marketplace where they can move goods across 16 countries. Oops, sorry. Here, okay. So what it means is we have access to 48% of the world in terms of consumer market. We have one of the largest consumer markets, just 16 countries alone. Okay. Share of GDP at the moment is still quite low, only about 1/3 of world GDP within the 16 countries, but it's going to grow. And this is what is interesting. Current flow, without the FTA, without the mega RCEP, our intra-regional trade is already 45% of total trade for these 16 countries. So can you imagine, once the borders open up, how much more trade will flow within the 16 countries? So that, for a lot of the major manufacturing companies, this is what is interesting. Okay, so what do we expect out of RCEP? Negotiations have been going on for the last 3 years. Okay, the target is to conclude by 2015 as well. They're supposed to conclude negotiations this year. May or may not happen because some analysts have said it really depends on the TPP, what's happening in the TPP, because this RCEP involves China and and India. So these are traditionally, China has not paid very much attention to the RCEP until the TPP came along. So once the TPP kicked in and once the US mooted and pushed for the TPP to move forward, that's where China became very interested in moving RCEP negotiations. India joined RCEP very reluctantly. That was under the old Congress administration. But with Modi, the new Modi government in place, there seems to be a little bit more excitement about negotiating the RCEP. And because India wants to export, so for them, the RCEP is a potential platform for them to gain duty-free access to to their biggest markets in the Asian region. So that's a good platform for India. Now, Indonesia. Indonesia is a little bit on the fence. Okay, Indonesia, before President Jokowi came into power, they have been dragging. They were not very positive. They were highly protectionist. In fact, they are still increasingly protectionist. The problem with Indonesia is that they have a pro-business precedent. Unfortunately, the parliament is captured by protectionist factions. So now we have an internal conflict in Indonesia. We don't know who will win ultimately. There have been a push by Ministry of Commerce to be very active. We have heard from RCEP negotiators that Indonesia is taking a very, very active interest in negotiations again. When in the past they have been dragging their feet, not very enthusiastic. But now it seems Indonesia is supporting RCEP negotiations and seem to want to, because Indonesia is the big brother in ASEAN. Nothing will move in ASEAN without Indonesia support. So now with RCEP, with Indonesia being a little bit more supportive of RCEP, we expect the negotiation process on the part of ASEAN to move as well. So the very optimistic people thinks RCEP negotiations can conclude this year. I'm not that optimistic. I'm optimistic up to a certain level. I think they will have to conclude something. It will be substantive conclusion, but a lot of the details, a lot of the very difficult decisions, a lot of the sensitive decisions would be made after this year. So the leaders at the end, I think October, November, they will announce something. But what exactly, how much, how substantive that announcement would be, we don't know. It's still up in the air. Okay, but for trade in goods, these are the commitments. We are using the ASEAN Plus One as like a basis for comparison, because the RCEP is actually building on the ASEAN Plus One FTA. So what is contained in the ASEAN Plus One FTA, we expect it to be the base. Everything will be plus, will be in addition to the ASEAN Plus One. So these are existing commitments under trade in goods. So these are the, for example, under AFTA, under the ASEAN trade agreement, Vietnam, for example, about 98% of their tariffs are at zero. They will liberalize. For India, for example, under the ASEAN-India FTA, India has committed to to open up 78% of their goods market under the ASEAN Plus One. So this is something that we can expect as the baseline. Okay, so this is up for negotiations. They are negotiating the tariff modalities right now. The modalities. Request and offer is expected in the next, I think in May. There's a negotiation session in May. That's where countries are supposed to exchange their market access offers. Okay, and then they're also negotiating the rules of origin, which again we expect it to be based on the ASEAN Plus One FTA. So if you are keen to find out roughly what you can expect out of RCEP, is a good bet to go look at. The lowest common denominator is the ASEAN-India one. That has the least amount of market opening. So you can hopefully expect at least this amount of market access. But again, India has come out to say, they are thinking of 40%, but that's not going to hold. Yeah. So we're expecting a little bit more. The final, I think that objective when they reach market access for goods, opening is 80% of all goods, both in terms of number of tariff lines and in terms of volume of trade. Okay, I won't go into services. I think most of you are in goods. I finished the RCEP part? Yeah? Okay, so I go on. So what will happen after AEC and RCEP? After 2015, what will happen? This is what we are expecting. ASEAN will expand. East Timor, or Timor-Leste, has already applied to join ASEAN. They have applied to join ASEAN quite a while back. There was only one obstacle. Singapore. Singapore has raised concerns about Timor-Leste joining ASEAN, because Singapore thinks that Timor-Leste may not be prepared, may not be ready to take on so much responsibilities, joining ASEAN means, because there's a lot of market opening, there's a lot of participation in regional activities, not just in the economic side, because joining ASEAN is not just joining the free trade area, it's also joining the political security forum, it's also participating in the social cultural element. So ASEAN is about everything, not just economics. So Singapore does not think Timor-Leste is ready yet, but there's a lot of capacity building going on, a lot of technical assistance to help bring Timor-Leste to a level that we think they will be ready to join ASEAN. So that's one big event here. Then right now, negotiating. ASEAN is now negotiating an agreement with Hong Kong. This is interesting because ASEAN is not interested in negotiating with Hong Kong. Really, truly. We are only negotiating with Hong Kong because a lot of trade with China flows through Hong Kong. So this is a logical agreement for all of us to negotiate, mostly because of China trade. So this is ongoing right now, and we don't know whether, when we are done with the ASEAN plus Hong Kong FTA, whether Hong Kong will apply to accede to RCEP, which is natural, again, because of the trade flows to southern China, most of it goes to Hong Kong. Pakistan has been asking for an FTA with ASEAN. ASEAN has not said yes in a very long time. It is an observer. Pakistan is an observer in the ASEAN process. So this is a maybe, because again, Pakistan may not be ready for the type of, at least in trade goods, to open up their market to ASEAN goods. This is a very new development with Russia, the customs union involving Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Vietnam has, I think last month, announced conclusion of FTA with the customs union. They have not ratified it yet, so we are now expecting about a 1 to 2 year ratification period and implementation. But what this means is that because of the Russia problems, because of the sanctions against Russia, Russia is now looking to Asia, because Asian countries, unless it's a UNSC sanctions, ASEAN would not, in most cases, impose unilateral sanctions on Russia. So this, to Russia, this is a good bet for Asia. And for Asian countries, for Thailand, for Vietnam, Russia is the next big market. Because now they do not have competition from the US or from the EU anymore. Because of the sanctions again, Vietnam and Thailand can now export to Russia competitively, because they have their biggest competitors have gone out of the market. So they have a free-for-all in the Russian market. It's a big win for some of these countries. So we are expecting a little bit more activities in Asia involving Russia. GCC is difficult. Negotiations is horrible. It takes a very long time. Implementation is even worse. Singapore negotiations ended and signed about, when was this? In the early 2010s. It was supposed to be implemented in 2013, supposed to. Singapore implemented it in 2013. But I think the GCC authorities did not get the news that the FTA is in place, so nobody implemented it. And right now, the advice is if you want to use the GCC Singapore FTA, please check with the GCC country you want to import into, because we have no idea whether the customs authority on the ground in the port is implementing this FTA or not. So negotiating is one thing. Getting the agreement implemented is another big trouble, and that usually does not hit the government. Governments negotiate. It's the businesses that will get the bad news that, no, I'm sorry, you cannot use the FTA. So you do have to do your homework before, especially if any of the FTAs are new, please check with the local authorities first before you send your shipment out. Because you don't want your shipment to be held at the importing country and you have to pay 100% duty, which quite a few of the GCC import duties, that's the level that they are at. And then, of course, Sid mentioned TPP already. We are looking at potentially, Korea has already initiated Phyllis, to join the TPP. We don't know when, probably not now, it will be later on. At what conditions, we have no idea. Thailand say they want to, but because right now their political situation is a little bit tough, they're still technically operating under a military junta. So that's not, I don't think the EU is likely to let Thailand start negotiating for accession anytime soon. Now, the EU part, this is the next big one. This is what I think Japanese companies will be interested in as well. In ASEAN, EU has already concluded FTA with Singapore. We are now looking at the ratification process. The rough time frame is between 1 to 2 years for ratification. They do have to translate the document into multiple national languages of the EU. So we are looking at a 2-year time frame. They concluded end of last year, so we are expecting perhaps, if conditions are right, implementation next year. Okay. Vietnam, Malaysia is negotiating. Thailand again has stalled because of the military coup. Again, Thailand wants to get the negotiation started. Not going to happen anytime soon because, again, human rights issues and the military government not exactly helping. So I don't expect the Thailand EU FTA to move anytime soon. But what is important? These are all individual ASEAN countries with the EU. All right. But one unique feature of the EU FTA with ASEAN, and this one we can see from the Singapore FTA, it has, for trade in goods, it has accumulation portion. So anytime, let's say next year or this year, Vietnam finish negotiations. So when it comes to trade in goods, Singapore and Vietnam origin can enter the EU market enjoying duty preference, technically. So it's as if there is a Singapore-Vietnam-EU FTA. All right, because that's not, at this point in time, we don't think there's going to be ASEAN-EU FTA anytime soon. But individually, so there will be like a jigsaw puzzle, kind of. So we finish, whoever finished first will get fitted in, and then it's almost like building up a regional FTA between ASEAN and the EU. So that's a building block approach for that the EU is taking. And then also another side point for EU, because EU has an association agreement with Turkey. And under the Turkey-Malaysia FTA, there's also a similar accumulation provision. So we are looking at now very active building blocks between EU and EU's associated countries. Then for EU, there's also negotiations going on with India, Japan, Korea. Korea is implemented. Korea has been very aggressive. The other big one that you want to take care of, just now we were mentioning, Japan does not have an agreement with China, but Korea has just concluded negotiations with China. And although text officially has not come out yet, the only exclusion, for goods, for trade in goods, the only exclusion is really rice. That's the only exclusion under the China FTA. China-Korea FTA. Only rice is excluded. All the other products are included. I think the maximum liberalization period is about 18 years. So within 18 years, you will get a zero duty for most products. Although there are some products that will not reach zero, but still for most products it will reach zero in about 18 years between Korea and China. So that's the advantage right now that Korea has. And this last one, which is mooted by China, this is a big development. I mean, this is something that President Xi Jinping just talked about. This is an initiative that is mooted by China. But we have already received some queries from our clients to ask what is going to happen. Because some of our multinational clients, they do have a lot of market interest in the developing markets of Central Asia. And they supply from Europe, they supply from China. So what is going to happen when or if Silk Road and Maritime Silk Road initiatives kick in? As it is, we look at it here now. Under the ASEAN-China FTA, there is supposed to be a land infrastructure that is built from China down to Peninsula Southeast Asia. So that is already in the works. There's a lot of infrastructure projects built by in the process of building in Laos and Cambodia, building a lot of roads that connects Kunming in Western China all the way down to Malaysia and Singapore. And we're talking again also about a railway link from China all the way down to Singapore. So these are major developments that we are looking at. It will not be realized in the next 3 to 5 years, but we are definitely, and our clients are definitely looking at what potential there is for their Central Asia interests and for their Southeast Asia interests, simply because they manufacture, they export to these markets. And even though now it's just a very big policy level type of initiative, what our clients are also looking at is how can they influence the process? How can they talk to the different governments in the Central Asia countries in terms of opening up their markets to take into account the developments of the Silk Road initiative. So it's not just about planning the production, because planning the production comes after the FTA kicks in, after a regional trade agreement kicks in, when it's a reality. But this one is a pre-FTA negotiations type of planning process that some of the companies are going through in terms of how do we make sure that our interests, what we want in terms of market opening, in terms of production flows, how do we ensure that our interests, our concerns are taken care of in the negotiations. So this is part of their government engagement process, and where they are building right now to building and starting to look at what sort of engagement they should have with the Central Asian governments to make sure that they are included when these governments actually operationalize the initiative. So this is what I would like to leave you with, because again, like I said, FTAs is not just about implementing your supply chain, but it's also influencing the government policies to the way that, it will make sure that you're not left behind when the FTA is finally negotiated. So I would like to leave you with that for any questions or answers.
Thank you very much.